Hi, it's Dr. Goldkamp, and welcome back to another episode of the Keto Naturopath on YouTube. Today I wanted to go over some basic differences between intermittent fasting and how I am advocating and how people should be eating protein. It's not just me that's advocating this, by the way. So I figured a head-to-head comparison of how these things look, and there's validity on both sides, and they're not in opposition. But I think to have an understanding, because a lot of people who are listening to something about a protein-sparing modified fast, certainly through me, are going, wait a minute, this is very different than intermittent fasting, which I've been told is healthy to do, and I should do it. So there's a bit of clash, what they call a cognizant dissonance of a sort. So let's go through that, okay? So first is how most people are told to eat is like this. Here's how most people are told to eat. They used to call it the diabetic diet, by the way, and that's not been called that for a while. But the idea is that you're eating frequently over the day, but small meals. So every time that you're eating, your glucose goes up, followed by your insulin to keep your glucose down. So then your glucose is forced down. And then you eat the next time, it goes up, then it goes down, it goes up, then it goes down. So for, let's say 6 times, makes sense. Breakfast, snack, lunch, snack, dinner, snack. So this is actually still advocated for diabetics. You know, eat smaller, but eat more frequently. So your blood sugar, the idea will be always a straight line. Well, it doesn't quite work out that way. It's the ups and downs and ups and downs. And it's exhausting for your pancreas that has to produce all this insulin. And then for the rest of the body as well, but certainly this is how you get pancreatic fatigue or exhaustion. Okay, so enter the concept of intermittent fasting to change that, or time-restricted eating, however you want to think of it. So they're saying, and this is fine, this is not wrong, mind you. They're saying, okay, well, let's skip breakfast, have your snack, skip lunch, have an afternoon snack, actually just have dinner. So if you can get it down to just 2 times a day, that would be quite the intermittent fast. That is, you finished by 7 and you're not going to eat again until 9 the next morning. So that would be 14 hours. That's pretty long in terms of intermittent fasting. But you see the concept here. You eat far fewer meals. You eat less frequently. And therefore, you've taken the work off your pancreas and so on and so forth. So this is the concept of intermittent fasting. It's a concept of time-restricted eating, having a smaller eating window, and all that's fine. And by the way, you know, this is certainly something that I have to convey in our courses because people need to know this concept, and it has viability. A lot of people agree on it. Not the Diabetic Association. They don't agree on much other than more insulin and more food. Not really. Okay, so let's go on from that. I wanted to show you how do we know about insulin and what's the more sinister story that insulin tells, okay? And its connection with obesity and diabetes and metabolic disorders. Let's start down the track. So there's this test called a glucose tolerance test. So what that means, and nobody likes taking it, it's actually a terrible test. I've had to give it to a number of people. But ideally, what part of this is standard. It's been around for at least 70 years, if not longer. You take 75 grams of glucose. You eat that, and it's kind of revolting to most people. It's just too much. And then they would measure. You know, you come in fasting, so you're fasting glucose, then 30 minutes later, then 60, 90, and then end up at 2 hours, sorry. So there was a man called Dr. Kraft. And he started the concept back out of his own curiosity. He added a $5 test called insulin. So he did a fasting insulin test with fasting glucose to see how the insulin is doing. So this is a normal person, a normal healthy person. They had their 75 grams of sugar, you know, and that's where the rise and the fall of the glucose. But you also see the rise of the insulin, which forces down the glucose, serum glucose levels, right, to a quote-unquote normal level. And all that takes place 30 minutes to an hour. That's the normal. That's the norm. We're comparing it to that. Well, then you have a person who's been eating a lot of carbs generally and not much else, and probably a lot of processed foods. So their situation changes from normal to not so normal. They will still have a normal-looking glucose pattern, but their insulin, it takes a lot more insulin secreted by the pancreas to keep that glucose down to the normal range. So now we have another organ sort of behind the scenes working really hard to secrete more insulin to make it look like there's a normal glucose level, okay? Now we go beyond that even. Eventually, the person cannot make enough insulin, and in fact, it starts to get exhausted. So it's pancreatic exhaustion. And what happens is this is when you first start to see uncontrolled glucose levels. It just doesn't come down very quickly. So what took 30 minutes to maybe 60 minutes for that normal person to bring back their blood glucose levels to a normal level, it's still not normal and they're 2 hours out. So what Dr. Kraft did, he started taking the insulin, so he got these different patterns. And he also, and here's even worse, here's the insulin that goes along with that progressive, that glucose level that is not in the normal range at all. Look where the insulin is. So he was the first to sort of couple all these. He did it on his own. He paid out of pocket. Everybody came in. He said, all right, here's your fasting glucose, which was a normal test you request by everybody. And then if you suspect something, you have them do the glucose tolerance test, otherwise known as GTT. And he started seeing that, wow, not everybody's the same. There's a big range of people who are producing a lot of insulin and can bring their glucose back to normal, and others that can't, and they're beyond control. So he basically made these 4 levels. There's normal, abnormal, more abnormal, and just horrendous. And so he titled these, insulin is normal, hyperinsulinemia, pattern 1, hyperinsulinemia, pattern 2, and on it goes. So now he has a map of, wow, people are not all the same in terms of being able to control their glucose. Probably wondering where we're going with all this. This is just another way to represent that. Here's normal. So when you think of total sugar, total glucose exposure for normal is represented in blue. And as you start to lose your ability to control your glucose, higher, longer levels of glucose are the norm for that person, which is dangerous. It causes a lot of problems. And it goes on and on and on. So when you look at the diabetic, of course, is the green, is that they have high levels of blood sugar all the time, and that's a definite pathology. Okay, so why did I want to show you that? I wanted to show you that to go over the macros relative to how they affect your blood glucose and how protein is a big, important part of that. So here's the obvious. Carbohydrates make your blood sugar go up when you take them, right? We're talking about whole food, not processed food. Processed food would be a whole nother graph that would make it even worse. Protein, yep, just raises your insulin. It raises your glucose just a little bit and then really nothing at all. Fat doesn't affect blood sugar and therefore doesn't affect glucose. So Dr. Kraft, he tested in the course of, he started in the 70s, finished in the 90s, in the course of 20 years, he tested 14,000 people. So plenty of data to saying, this is what I see. And of course, since then, all functional practitioners and most docs that have a self-awareness of this, they will ask, if they're asking their patients to do a glucose tolerance test, to include insulin. So you have they go in tandem with insulin and glucose. All right, that's the background. And it goes on and saying, yep, diabetes, here's the diabetic corner here. 3/4 were undiagnosed. 75% of the people with normal glucose results failed Kraft's test. In other words, that's the kind of patient that a doctor would have said, oh, you're doing great. But when you throw in the insulin, you go, no, you're not doing great. You got a problem here. Interesting, eh? Okay, so what are the take-home messages from him? Is that normal insulin with normal glucose is a true normal glucose. We'll call that a duh, but he's the one that documented it, so he could say that. The damage of diabetes is vascular, so that's heart, it's brain, it's lung, it's organs. We are diagnosing diabetes too late. Diabetes is not a chronic progressive disease if it is prevented. So basically start measuring glucose. The last of this was, there was some research followed for 6 years of people in 3 different categories of low insulin, medium insulin, and high. And well, they find those who had high insulin had terrible outcomes at the end of 6 years. Specifically, the insulin resistance group, which is the high insulin, blew away all of the other biometrics. It was insulin independent that was the highest correlation of their death rate and illness rate. So let me just finish that up here. So it's really all about managing your insulin, right? How do we keep insulin low? People who are heavy and listening to this, more than likely you're heavy because you've had a sustained high level of insulin, because you've had a sustained high level of glucose in your lifetime. How do we change that? But the story is about insulin. What do? This is just putting this topic to bed. What do? You drop the carbs, eat fewer times per day. Remember, this is the intermittent fasting model. Exercise resistant training. We'll go over details later. Okay, so now we're going to talk about muscle mass. Why are we talking about muscle mass? Because when we think of blood glucose, sugar, 2 questions. How much is being made, which is really how much are we eating? You can eat it, and you also can stress yourself so much that you're producing it, called gluconeogenesis. Separate topic, but for the most part, you're eating it or you're making it. But it's you. You're eating it or you're making it. You're having that Pop-Tart or you're really stressed out, but you are making your blood sugar high. Okay, but the other side of it is, well, who's consuming it? Where does that blood sugar go? Okay, it goes where? It goes into, even if you have higher insulin, it goes out of the bloodstream into muscle, into fat for sure. But the variable is the biggest consumer, the biggest place to put glucose, is your muscle. So in the making of glucose is 1/2 of the equation. How much is being made? Are you eating it or are you making it, right? And most people that have a really high refined carb diet, they're eating it and they're really stressed. And so they're doing both. Well, how are we consuming this? How are we taking it out of the bloodstream? Your muscle mass is that entity. It's the largest consumer of blood glucose in your entire body. So you want muscles that can suck up blood sugar right out of your bloodstream. And by the way, that has nothing to do with insulin. You have blood sugar that's high and you have a good muscle mass, it takes it right out. And when you work out, if you have a muscle mass, even just walking is something. You are going to suck out that blood glucose. So it's the muscles that are actually doing the job of bringing down your glucose, not the insulin in that case. It's a much healthier way of controlling your blood sugar. Okay, so lack of muscle is sarcopenia, as we've talked about before. And here we look at obese, a heavy person with low muscle mass. They are really stuck because they don't have the ability to suck off, to dispose of glucose. So what they make or what they eat quickly saturates their bloodstream, and then it's all about insulin. Insulin's going to get it out of the bloodstream, put it in the liver, put it in the pancreas, put it in fat cells, put it in the muscle. That's why people have fatty heart, they have fatty muscles. It degrades the quality of your muscles. Then you move with somebody who has slightly more muscle mass. They have a better ability. So obese with normal muscle mass. Then you have obese with high muscle mass. Obese is probably a misused word. So as I referenced before, think of the Arnold Schwarzenegger. He was not obese. He was a big muscled guy. He was hypertrophied in terms of muscle. So he had great blood sugar, apart from the steroids he was taking. But he had great control over his blood sugar back in the day in which he had a lot of muscle mass, is the point here. Okay, then. You have people that look normal. We've talked about thin on the outside and fat on the inside. They are fat. They do not have the ability to take the sugar, the glucose, out of their bloodstream. So what happens? They get fat, but because they don't have muscles, for 2 reasons, they're doubly problematic. They look normal, but they don't have the ability to suck off all that excess glucose and be healthy because they have no muscle mass. So they are fat, they wear the fat, and they have the space to wear the fat and look normal because they don't have a muscle mass. So the fat of somebody who doesn't have a muscle mass is usually inside. And some people have, so this is called visceral fat, and this is called subcutaneous fat. So there's two ways. One could be atophy, thin on the outside and fat on the inside. Different topic, also interesting. Okay then, so insulin resistance, diabetes, and loss of muscle mass and function are the primary threats to healthy aging. So it's two parts. So when we talk about, it's not just the people that go to the gym, it's lack of activity atrophies your muscle mass becomes smaller, you have lost your ability to take off, to take out, to dispose of that glucose in your bloodstream. That puts you at risk. So merely because the fact that you do not have adequate amount of muscle mass, which by the way is the majority of the people who live in the United States today, it's like they are at a disadvantage. And that has nothing to do with the food that they're eating. So now you put such a person that has low muscle mass with a standard American diet, which is high carb and high fat, they're going to get various diseases. As we learned, it's mostly vascular, it's heart attack, it's strokes, it's embolisms, it's phlebitis, on and on. And that's just, the list is much larger than that for sure. But what I'm saying is, not just for blood sugar control, as if we're talking about diabetes, but by not having it, and many people are under-muscled, many people don't go to the gym, many people are not physically active, and they think that's fine. They think it's just a lifestyle thing. No, it's worse than smoking cigarettes in some aspects, in most aspects. They don't have the ability to, in a healthy way, regulate their blood glucose. And so that's what this is about. Here's the difference of glucose uptake. If you have muscle mass, you can absorb, dispose of glucose very quickly, almost immediately. It has nothing to do with insulin. Pretty neat, huh? Okay, so we now see your muscles, and I would suggest looking at your muscles as something that you have to feed independently from the rest of your body. Start there. So I have muscles, I have to feed my muscles today. I didn't say you have to go to the gym. That would be good, but you have to feed your muscles today. What are you going to feed your muscles? You're going to feed your muscles with protein and have that be a whole food source, which primarily is animal sources of protein. The meat, the fish, the poultry, the lamb, the pork, the etc., right? So if you think of it that way, when you eat protein, your muscles will actually grow. So part of the reason that people are under-muscled, it's not because they didn't sign up for gym class. It's not because they don't take tennis class or go to the gym. That's part of it. That's a small part of it, actually. It's because they don't eat sufficient amount of protein. So every time, as we've gone out before, talked about before, you eat sufficient amount of protein, it will stimulate muscle growth or muscle protein synthesis, right? So this is a synthesis and this is the breakdown, muscle protein breakdown. All right, so that's just eating 3 times a day. We know you can improve on that. The first thing you can do to improve on is you eat 4 times a day and look at the change that that makes. Now we're into muscle protein synthesis, building muscle, longer than we're breaking down muscle. In this particular illustration, that refers to weight resistance training. So this person eating sufficient protein 4 times a day, as opposed to all at once. We're not eating more protein. We're eating the same amount of protein over 4 different servings. So let's say you now have a breakfast, and you now have a dinner, and you now have a late morning snack, and you now have an early or an afternoon snack. And this is just the opposite of what we've heard about intermittent fasting. So here's the clash. Oh my gosh, what is this? How should I eat? And don't worry about it. I would say protein-sparing fast really clears this up, because in the protein-sparing fast, or those few days you're doing it, hopefully you'll transition to a nice lifestyle of something similar by adding in organ meats and so on, but that you're not having carbs, and therefore you're not bringing in that glucose. And it's a transition. People don't just snap to it in a day, but they get more and more comfortable with doing that. So you move more to protein, you're dropping your carbs, and you're building muscle mass, which is now helping you absorb your blood glucose. So here's the other way of eating. So the question you're going to have to ask yourself is, how do you want to eat? This I know is the diabetic diet, eat a little bit, throughout the day. That has its validities. It's not entirely wrong. It's just hasn't served me. And hasn't served, I've never told my patients to eat this way. And then here's the intermittent fasting. It's marginally better. So one's muscle mass is directly associated with all-cause mortality. So what that means is when you don't have very much muscle, and what they did is they basically looked backwards from those who have died, whether they've died from a car accident, drug overdose, brain aneurysms, heart attack, phlebitis, autoimmune disorders, Alzheimer's, you name it. The highest association with all causes, all reasons of dying is low muscle mass. So the sarcopenia would be a more accurate way. One's sarcopenia is associated with all-cause mortality. So I want to end with this note to bring this together. We've seen there's two different ways of eating, and what I'm certainly advocating for is in the protein-sparing modified fast is that you're having 3 or 4 days lean proteins, not even much in the way of fats. And that is helping. Now you're building, just by eating that, I didn't even say go to the gym, just by eating that, you're helping to build your muscle mass, bring that up, and therefore you have the facility to manage your blood glucose, which is also then managing your insulin, meaning your insulin doesn't have to work so hard. Pancreas doesn't have to work so hard. Okay, if you want to go one step further in terms of building muscles, you have those 4 eating, they call them eating events, by the way, 4 eating events per day, 4 times a day that you're going to have protein. Same amount you would have, now you've calculated it, at 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, and that will put you at about 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. That's a good amount to eat. And so if you can calculate that 4 different times, amazing. And it doesn't have to be right before you go to bed, a couple hours before you go to bed. It's a normal dinner time for the most part. And then if you want to add resistance training to that, we'll get into what I think is the best form, what is advocated for, and certainly has worked for me, but we'll have that as a separate topic. So there you go. That's why protein-sparing modified fast isn't just for weight loss. It's really about blood sugar control, building your muscles, which even further gives you greater ability to blood sugar control, and we'll go from there. Okay? Talk to you later.